eager to hear what our panelists have to say. My name is Neil Hannes, and it's a pleasure of mine to have been contracted by the American Association of Geographers in support of their April annual conference, which will be held here in Hawaii. And as part of the preparation for being here, the association thought it would be important to start to connect with our culture, to connect with our issues, to connect with some of our people here, our thought leaders, to really help set a foundation so that this conference can be successful. And membership and the conferees can be informed as to what some of these issues are and prepare to kind of hit the ground running when they come here for the conference. It's going to be exciting. We not only have these webinars, we're going to have presentations at the conference that are from Oceania in general and Hawaii in particular, as well as land engagements here that'll kind of allow you to ground truth some of the concepts and principles. So we've had this webinar. This is the 6th in our series. They are recorded and posted on the website. So if you're not able to participate today, you may be watching this at some future date at your leisure and taking all this information in. And we're really pleased to have Kyle Kajihiro as kind of our moderator session. I'm moderating the series, and Kyle is moderating this session. Kyle is an assistant, let me get this right, Kyle, assistant professor of ethnic studies at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. His research and activism focuses on demilitarization movements in Hawaii and the Pacific region. He has the Hawaii Detours Project and is a board member of Hawaii Peace and Justice. And Kyle and his colleagues have entitled this webinar, Troubling the American Lake, Archipelagic Perspectives on Militarization in Oceania. Oh, what does that mean? And who do you have to share some content about that? Aloha, Kyle.
Aloha, aloha mai kako, hafa de todos, haisai gusuyo. Thank you, Neil, and the other folks at AAG for organizing this series. As many of you will be probably attending the annual meeting in Honolulu, we thought it'd be helpful to share some of the political geography of this region, and particularly from the perspective of the islands, which are often overlooked in geopolitical discourse. In 2011, at the APEC summit in Waikiki, President Obama unveiled his so-called Pacific Pivot. It was meant to signal a strategic shift in military, diplomatic, and economic focus and resources from Western and Central Asia to East Asia and the Pacific. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton characterized this region as the geopolitical center of gravity. Although Mahan's notion of sea power has arguably been proven to be more dominant in this region, invoking a geopolitical pivot was a nod to Halford Mackinder's classic geopolitical vision. But for those who know the history of Hawaii, the U.S. pivot to the Pacific began more than a century earlier with the U.S.-backed regime change and occupation of Hawaii in order to secure a mid-Pacific coaling station at Ke'awalao o Pu'uloa, or what most people today know as Pearl Harbor. You could say that Hawaii was an early fossil fuel coup d'etat. By taking Hawaii, the United States gained a critical platform from which to expand its imperial reach from Puerto Rico to the Philippines, with China as its prize. Senator Albert Beveridge expressed this imperial vision clearly in 1900. He wrote, "The Pacific is our ocean. The power that rules the Pacific is the power that rules the world. That power is and will forever be the American Republic," end quote. So we can see that Hawaii and now other islands in this region have served as fulcra for amplifying and extending U.S. military force and imperial formations across large areas of the planet. Today, the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, from its headquarters on a ridge overlooking Pearl Harbor, polices an area of responsibility extending from North America to the Central Indian Ocean, from Alaska to and includes the entire continent of Antarctica. So the Indo-Pacific Command covers most of the area of the planet and the majority of its population. Historically, the Pacific Ocean and Pacific Islands have been regarded by imperial powers as small, remote, and insignificant, which facilitated the partitioning and colonization of the region. In 1954, President Eisenhower said, quote, "We've got to keep the Pacific as an American lake." This imaginative diminution, distantiation, and partitioning of Oceania has enabled monumental acts of environmental destruction to occur out of sight and out of mind, such as the 67 nuclear and atomic tests in the Marshall Islands, the devastation of live fire training areas like Kaho'olawe, and recently the poisoning of Oahu's drinking water aquifer when jet fuel leaked from the massive Red Hill underground fuel storage facility. However, the Tongan intellectual Epeli Hau'ofa famously flipped the imaginative geography of the region from islands in a far sea to a vibrant sea of islands. Guided by the spirit of Hau'ofa and other Pacifica scholars and activists like Teresia Teawa, Kekuni Blaisdell, Hanani K. Trask, and Soli Niheu, this webinar will share perspectives on the U.S. Pacific pivot from the perspective of the islands challenging this hyper-militarization. So our panelists today, I want to welcome Dr. Kenneth Gofigan Kuper is an associate professor of political science and Micronesian studies at the Micronesian Area Research Center at the University of Guam. He focuses on geopolitics and international relations. Dr. Kuper is an indigenous CHamoru from Guåhan or Guam and a founding fellow at the Pacific Center for Island Security, a think tank analyzing security issues from an oceanic perspective. He'll discuss how Guam is becoming an epicenter of geopolitical tension between the United States and China. Primarily focusing on missile defense developments on the island, he highlights how islands such as Guam are often used as experimental sites and how this leads to a situation of sustainable insecurity in militarized communities. Next, we have Theresa Arriola, an indigenous CHamoru from the Northern Mariana Islands and the chair of Our Commonwealth 670, a grassroots organization working to counter the negative effects of U.S. militarization in the Northern Marianas. She is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Concordia University. Theresa will underscore the current forms of economic militarism underway in the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas, including the further reliance on militarism as an economic driver in light of the government's pivot away from Chinese tourism, which comprise about 60% of the market. She also highlights the forms of military propaganda in the media, including aggressive recruitment of youth and patriotic displays of violence. Tatsuki Kohatsu is a PhD candidate in geography and the environment at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. Mr. Kohatsu is an indigenous Okinawan scholar of militarization and resistance movements in the Ryukyu Islands. He will present a very brief history of the Ryukyu archipelago, mainly focusing on the U.S. occupation to the current situation with the U.S. military, the ongoing Japan self-defense force deployments into the other islands in the archipelago, and the increasing joint activities while touching upon some of the anti-militarism movements. And finally, Joy Lehuanani Enomoto is currently the executive director of Hawaii Peace and Justice and vice president of Hui Aloha Aina o Honolulu. She lives on the slopes of Pu'uwaina in the Ahupua'a of Honolulu. Joy is a community organizer, a popular educator, Pacific Island studies scholar and artist, and whose work focuses on feminist concepts of genuine security, demilitarization, and generative economies. Joy will provide highlights of the militarization underway in Hawaii and efforts to reclaim and restore Hawaiian lands that are currently occupied by the U.S. military. So we're going to follow that order. So thank you to all of our panelists. Welcome to this session, and we'll start out with Dr. Ken Kuper.
Kyle, thank you for that. And as we segue to Ken, I just want to remind the audience, point your attention to Elin's chat. Your questions are really quite welcome, and use the Q&A feature so that we can make this a really active and engaged dialogue. We'll try and get to as many of those questions as we possibly can. Thank you. Kalamai, take it, Ken. We're keen to hear from you.
All right, half a day. Aloha mai kākou. Kenneth Gofigan Kuper from Guam. I'm going first, even though Isa over here's last name begins with A. So let's just make this happen. All right, so I'm from the island of Guam. And our newest title, we used to be known as the Tip of the Spear. Now we are called the Forward Edge of the Indo-Pacific, reflecting the US's new geographical imagination of lumping this large swath of ocean and land into one area, as Kyle mentioned, with US Indo-Pacific Command, no longer just Pacific Command. Guam has been under the United States since, as a result of the Spanish-American War, since 1898. And I'll go into our political status, but as we talk about the sort of ways that islands are experimented on, what I want to present today are the three factors that I believe lead to Guam's current use as a militarized territory. So to begin, the first ingredient of this is location, right? Guam is closer by 14 hours flight time or 5 to 7 sea-days sea transit time to East Asia than other US-based facilities. It offers really the region's only live fire bombing range in conjunction with our northern brothers and sisters in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. Guam has an excellent deep water port. And at the end of the day, there are three parts of our location that are used by the United States military, and that is for logistics purposes, deterrence purposes, and lastly, credibility. Guam is a place to assure United States allies that the United States will always remain in the region. And we'll talk about that as it relates to our ontology as an unincorporated territory. If we're talking about geographical imagination and island chains, Guam is often considered to be and constitute the center of the second island chain used for logistic purposes with the first island chain. To discuss a little bit more about our geography and its importance, we can see in which the way our geographical formation as an island affected how American strategists thought about us. So this was an annual report of the governor. In 1905, Guam used to be under the naval administration. So whoever was the highest ranking naval official was the one who called the shots. So the location of Guam in the center of the Western Pacific makes it of great and recognized strategic value to the US. And this is quite interesting. It has neither present nor prospective economic value and should not then excite the interest of other than scientific and military men. It's very reminiscent of attempts by some United States officials to justify the taking of islands as not constituting colonialism, and not territorial aggrandizement, because these islands can only be used for military purposes. So they should not be considered colonial expansion. Kyle also mentioned Mahan. In one of Mahan's letters, he said this about my home island: no situation in our possession equals Guam for protecting every security interest in the Pacific. And as a result of that, Guam currently is occupied by the United States military. We're a 212 square mile island. 27% of that is occupied by the Department of Defense for large military installations, primarily Andersen Air Force Base in the north of the island, Naval Base Guam in the south of the island, and as we'll be talking about a little bit later, a largely expanded Marine Corps base in the center of the island now, or rather in the north, but with center installations. As a result of this, we also see Guam getting the brunt of geopolitical threat. First, we started getting it from North Korea in 2013. A threat was made by North Korea declaring that their missiles could reach the military bases in Guam. And a spokesperson for the North Korean People's Armies actually stated the US should not forget that the Andersen Air Force Base on Guam, where B-52s take off, are within our striking range. So this is the reality that we're attuned to, constantly being threatened by the enemies and the adversaries of the United States, right? So here is the DF-26. This is a Chinese missile. It's been known and dubbed the Guam killer. So Guam tends to be at the top of the target list if the US goes to war in the Asia-Pacific region. The capability of potential missiles to reach Guam is very much known. Furthermore, Chinese developments in hypersonic technologies, as well as air and surface capabilities, have even intensified this threat. So we can see that the US military subsequently takes these threats seriously. For example, in 2020, the Department of Defense removed what they called the continuous bomber presence of B-52s and B-1s in Guam, replacing this with a new semi-doctrine called the Agile Combat Employment. Agile Combat employment is rather to spread out the risk of being targeted by distributing assets to more islands, right? So we can see here our islands are consistently the fallback position for US military power projection. In this way, we are experimental sites. Okay, so the Air Force, for example, is developing divert airfields in case Andersen Air Force Base and Guam's airport runway are not available. And one of the top places they're doing this is in Tinian, as Isa will talk about. So the Chinese have made it clear that Guam is a target. A Chinese analyst recently noted that the US has made Guam the world's largest island military base. Chinese Air Force have reportedly practiced targeting Guam. Andersen Air Force Base has featured in Chinese attack videos, and there are indications that our harbor, which I mentioned earlier, was a mock-up for Chinese ballistic missile practice. State-run media in China have said that the US forces in Guam pose a great threat to the People's Liberation Army. So this is where this leaves us. Guam may one day be the grass on which the proverbial elephants fight. But here's the more important part that I think we need to discuss, and is when we discuss militarization. Even if these elephants do not fight on the grass, the field is forever changed in preparation for a fight. Because at the end of the day, that which happens to prepare for conflict can, like conflict itself, also be destructive. And I don't think we realize that. We think our bar for peace is that it's the absence of war. But rather, as we see in islands and experimenting in islands for the defense of the United States continent, often our peace is decreased, and rather we are put in an insecure position in order to protect peace as the definition of the absence of war. So we see this with the marine location to Guam. So location is Guam's number one ingredient. Number two, as I said, is the fact of being an island. But number three is our current political status. If we're talking about a sort of a variation of sovereignty in the American lake, well, Guam is the unincorporated territory. If you don't know what an unincorporated territory is, I'll break it down into like four main components. Really, we have no voting representation. We have no electors in the Electoral College, so you can't blame us for any president that has ever been elected, especially in recent history. You can't blame us. We have no voting representation in the House. We've absolutely no representation in the Senate. And the only place in the Constitution that mentions territory, rather, is the territorial clause. So as a result, we unincorporated territories are under the so-called plenary power of the United States, right? So that's our lived reality. And the US Supreme Court has held that so long as Congress does not abridge the fundamental rights of individuals living in the territories, Congress can enact laws that treat the territories differently than the states. Okay, so those are the three ingredients that I argue make up Guam's current ontology as a place to be experimented on and as a place to defend the United States. Our geographic formation as an island, our current political status as an unincorporated territory, and our geographic location. I argue that they work together, right? And at the end of the day, for the United States, remote colonial islands with small colonial populations would be the easiest to acquire and would entail the least political headaches. Often when Guam is discussed, the fact that we're a territory means that we won't provide political headache to the United States. That makes us useful. So our disposability is our importance, right? So this used to be the forward edge of the Indo-Pacific on the Andersen Air Force Base. This was their Facebook banner for a while. So due to Guam's status as an unincorporated territory, if we look at this from a security context, I argue that Guam is not the referent object to be protected, but rather is a component of the response repertoire to protect the referent object of the United States proper. Even though we're told that the military is there to protect Guam, I think we are just a tool to be used to protect the United States. And the prioritization of this traditional sense of security is not only narrow, but it's actively kept narrow, and thus, in turn, decreases our genuine security. The US is invested in reproducing its hegemony in the island and the continued narrowing of security to US military security. To put it another way, they try to argue that what is good for US security is good for Guam's security, and I think that's a false assumption. Maybe that could be the case in some instances, but definitely not in all. I describe this as the macabre duet, because our current political status, as well as being strategically located and an island, is the ground by which the United States can gamble with Guam for the pursuit of their national interest. Let's look at some quotes. This is from a brigadier general. Since Guam is part of the United States, potential operations from here are not subject to foreign government approval or international agreements. Here's another one. This is American soil in the midst of the Pacific. Guam is a US territory. We can do what we want here and make huge investments without fear of being thrown out. And that they are. We, in the current age of competition between the United States and China, we are where America's next war may begin. One of the largest developments in this realm has been the first Marine Corps base to be activated since 1952. You can see that this is a sprawling base. They've cleared a lot of land in a part of the island to make way for this base. And so really Guam is becoming this epicenter. And this actually came out of an agreement between the United States and Japan to remove some of the pressure on Okinawa to Guam. So we'll talk about that a little bit later, probably during the Q&A. And related to that, to defend Guam against the hyper threat that I've discussed earlier in this presentation, they are now talking about something called an enhanced integrated air and missile defense system. So they think, the United States military thinks, that it can create a comprehensive, persistent 360-degree missile defense system to defend the entirety of Guam. This has not been done before. And so Guam is the epicenter of experimentation for creating such a staunch defense system. In fact, former heads of the Missile Defense Agency have said the lessons that we learn in Guam, we can use for the United States, like California. So we can see that, right? What they're doing here is they're combining Army systems, naval systems, Missile Defense Agency command and control systems, and they're trying to make them work together so that there can be a full picture to defend Guam. But in our mind, what is that who is causing the threat? Is it the people of Guam? Or, as I've alluded to earlier with the Chinese state media, is it the largely intense military presence in Guam that then causes the threat? As a people lacking the self-determination to determine our political destiny right now, we are in a critical place. Our geopolitical future is highly contingent on the fact that we don't control our foreign policy. And that's why we in Guam are fighting for decolonization and self-determination, because only then can we dictate what our role in the world is, because our current role in the world is that of war. And so I want to end with a quote from my mentor, Dr. Robert Underwood, who said, "The military is a 12-foot giant in our house. He is bound to step on some of your children. And as we will see in the next presentations, this 12-foot giant also occupies many other homes. Maybe together we can do some things to help protect our children in all of our places." Sizus Masi, thank you.
Mahalo, Ken. That's great. All right. So now I'll pass it to Theresa, Isa. Dr. Arriola, please take it away.
One second, let me get the screen going here. Is this?
I think put it in the presenter. Okay, there you go. Presenter mode, and then you can move the.
Sorry. There we go. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. Good day, everyone. Can you hear me? Is my audio good? Okay, great. I just want to quickly thank you, Kyle, and the AAG folks for organizing this panel and bringing us together for this conversation, this really timely conversation. As Kyle mentioned, my name is Theresa Arriola, or Isa. I'm an assistant professor at Concordia University in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, but I'm actually currently on my home island of Saipan. And I am the chair of a grassroots community organization that Kyle also mentioned called Our Commonwealth 670. And I'll be talking a little bit about how we're seeing the hyper-militarization of our islands. So if you don't already know this, I just wanted to briefly touch on the fact that we are a U.S. Commonwealth. The Northern Marianas are U.S. Commonwealth, and that this was a status that was negotiated in the mid-1970s, in which we entered into what we call a political union, quote, with and under the sovereignty of the United States of America. So our terms of this agreement are really laid out in what we call our covenant. And what's noteworthy for this presentation and this discussion is to note that in section 103 and 104 in the covenant, two things are stated. The first is that the people of the Northern Mariana Islands will have the right of local self-government and will govern themselves with respect to internal affairs in accordance with our own constitution that we adopted. And the second is that the United States will have complete responsibility for and authority with respect to matters relating to foreign affairs and defense affecting the Northern Mariana Islands. And so I put in here this timeline that's actually on the Bureau of Military Affairs website in the CNMI to note that arguably in the post-World War II period, this hyper-militarization is getting a jump start really at the creation of this agreement itself in a lot of ways, which hands over national defense at the time of the signing, right? So this helps you kind of situate why we're even talking about this here in the CNMI. I want to give you a very a broad overview and just touch on some of the military planning that's been happening in the CNMI, especially since the mid-2000s, and end with how this is currently shaping our government's political and economic decision-making in the Northern Mariana Islands today. And I'll show you that in some of the media that we're seeing on island. So years after Obama's Pacific pivot that Kyle mentioned, you're also seeing an exponential increase in U.S. funding to the broader Micronesian regions in the form of aid, development programs, right? All kinds of things, the renegotiating COFA agreements and military funding. As one policy strategist put it, the Pacific Island clusters of Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia share a geopolitical reality. They lie in the main space that separates the world's two biggest powers. The United States has retained an arc of territories and bases across the northern reaches of Oceania, though it has at times neglected the underlying relationships that support this access. And so you're seeing, at least in the media, right, a lot of the way that the U.S. is kind of getting involved in the region again through a lot of this funding is seen after a long lull in their kind of interest in a lot of Micronesian islands, right? So while there are a number of military projects that have emerged over the last decade throughout Oceania, especially beginning with the Obama administration's Pacific pivot, I'm going to touch on the four distinct and ongoing projects that are transforming the Marianas Archipelago and actually connecting our archipelagos in the Pacific. But of course, I'm coming from Saipan, so I have a focus on the CNMI. The first that Ken has already really gone over is the Guam and CNMI military relocation, colloquially understood as the buildup. Right now, we just call it the buildup. That's a term actually that I think we need to really examine a little bit more to become a noun, right? This thing, this kind of behemoth in our life. It was proposed in 2007 after the U.S.-Japan bilateral agreement and was finalized in 2010, right? So under this plan, originally you had 8,000 Marines and their dependents planned to be moved from Okinawa to Guam to support the already burgeoning base presence in Guam. And a lot of this has changed over the years. And I believe now that the size of the troops that are to be moved is somewhere in the ballpark of 5,000. So you're seeing a lot of pauses in this larger plan. So we're seeing that the buildup is being further accelerated by unprecedented levels of Pentagon spending. For example, in the fiscal year 2024 U.S. presidential budget, it's set at $886 billion for military and war preparations, right? So in Guam alone, the Pentagon wants to spend $1.5 billion on this missile and air system that Ken mentioned to counter attacks that are in striking distance to China and North Korea. According to a recent industry forum on Guam, there's $11 billion in new military construction, maintenance, and service contracts that are expected over the next 5 years. So At this event, Captain Robert Stiles noted that the CNMI Guam would, quote, experience the largest U.S. defense design, construction, supply, and service initiatives in recent history. So we're seeing this kind of promise of an economic boom. The second project is the Mariana Islands Training and Testing Study Area, which used to be called the Mariana Islands Range Complex. So the dotted line in red was the Mariana Islands Range Complex, and it effectively doubled in 2015 into what's called the MIT, right? The Mariana Island Training and Testing. It's just under 1 million square nautical miles, and there's so many different things that occur in this space. It's actually it's both the name of a Pentagon project and the name of a geographic area. So there's strike warfare, amphibious warfare training, assaults, firing exercise, and all other kinds of training and testing that happens in this region. And as you can see, it completely encompasses our airspace, our lands, our waters. And this, of course, overlaps with the buildup in many ways. And so one of the ways that community members have kind of subverted this military framing of the entire Marianas Archipelago is by calling it a military playground, or just simply a military bombing range, right? Because of the technicality of the language that's being used, this is often where you're seeing resistance. And so Noelani Goodyear Kaopua notes that together with the existing Hawaiian Islands Range Complex and the transit corridor between them, the new MIT opens America's largest training and testing weapons area in the world. So we're really seeing our connection to Hawaii. If you see that yellow dotted line behind the text, that's the transit corridor she's referring to. The third project is called the CJMT, which is a CNMI Joint Military Training Project. And what it proposed to do was build live fire training ranges on the islands of Tinian and Pagan that you see here in the archipelago. It would involve, on Tinian, it would involve 20 weeks of live fire training. And 2,200 military personnel would be coming to the island to train. On Pagan, this included 6 weeks of live fire training, and with 22 military personnel also coming to the island to do this training. What happened was in 2015, during the public comment period for this particular project, as part of the NEPA process, an unprecedented 30,000 comments came in from private citizens, as well as federal and CNMI agencies and other agencies throughout the Marianas that concerned the expansion of this military training. And so because of this significant amount of public resistance and input, it contributed significantly to the changes in the new proposed activities that are still in the works. So Pagan is off the table. So the military will not be using Pagan, but it still will be using the island of Tinian. And we're still waiting for the kind of updated project terms to come out. So one of the things that just happened very recently was that the military put on a sharing session about the CJMT project. Now, the sharing sessions are really to gather kind of community concerns and questions, and they're not necessarily to answer any of the questions that the community has, right? And so this has also been a really important source of resistance and kind of conversation on the island. And so much of what our organization does, and you can see from the two pictures on the right side, is that we try to raise awareness about how people can get involved in these meetings and public gatherings, right? And we also strategize to have our own meetings and gatherings that are outside of kind of formalized NEPA process. And so oftentimes we're trying to get the public to understand what questions maybe they could ask, right, at these meetings and things like that as a way to participate in this process. Although we do recognize how limited that participation can actually be. And lastly is the Tinian divert exercises. So Tinian in 2017 was chosen as the preferred alternative for a divert airfield in the event that access to basically Anderson Air Force on Guam was could not be accessed, or it was quote unquote denied. And so the divert airfield is currently under construction, and it includes airport infrastructural improvements, road construction, and importantly, what you can see on this slide is a fuel pipeline, right? And so there's a lot of logistical issues that the military is facing on Tinian, because in these spaces where they're building parking aprons and the airport and things like that, they're finding a lot of archaeological artifacts from 500 plus years ago, and it's taking a very long time to kind of complete this process. Okay. In 2022, the military released illicit discharge of topside sediment into the Tinian Harbor, and this photo was actually in the front page of one of the newspapers. And I'm showing it to you because while it was published in the front page of the newspaper, it wasn't just to kind of highlight, it wasn't to highlight that discharge went into the water. It was to highlight the kind of work that the military was doing on the island. And on the ground, from our organizational standpoint, it taught us that there really is no kind of clear mechanism for oversight for a lot of the planning that's happening on the island, right? So we have kind of acted as a watchdog in a lot of ways in our group. And so one of the other kind of issues that we're finding is that, and I want to touch on really briefly, as Kyle mentioned early on, was this issue of economic militarism, right? So as a result of all of the planning around the divert airfield construction, you're seeing a lot of talk about investment opportunities, right? And there's an estimated $3 billion in military and civilian infrastructure aid coming into Tinian. And so at one of the Chamber of Commerce meetings, for example, Philip Mendiola Long said, "There's tremendous excitement. Tinian will be an entrepreneur's promised land. If you choose to create businesses that support military installations and or the construction phases of those installations, you will do very well," right? So this is really the kind of broad narrative that we're seeing on island. And these are some of the social media posts that our organization puts out to try to counter a lot of that narrative, right? And to try to contextualize what's happening with the money on island. There's really hardly any other counter narratives in the media that contextualize where the funding is going. And so we try to provide these critical questions and discourses surrounding what we see happening here, right? So this was a post that we made to talk about, you know, what is all of this building up to, right? Where does all of this economic promise come from? Who are the people that it's serving? We see that it's saying that it's going to provide all of these job opportunities for residents, right? And that the divert airfield is good for the economy. But what about this problem, right? The perpetual cycle of ever higher U.S. military spending. So this has come out of the Watson Institute at Brown University's Cost of War project. And one of our things that our organization was trying to do was connect some of the dots, right? Connect ourselves to this broader military industrial complex and highlight how these opportunities are really bolstering further militarization to prop up our economy. And also just the question of who is benefiting, right? When we look at who's benefiting, like, for example, one of the contractors is Black Microcore, who's in Guam, but also got the contract for the Tinian Divert Airfield, made $221 million, right? So these are some of the questions that our community is asking in the midst of this burgeoning militarization, right? Like, how did these investments in war really divert away from our people's future, divert future investments in our people and our ancestral lands? Lastly, what you're seeing is, as a result of the U.S.'s intensive need to bolster its capabilities in this region, the government of the CNMI is increasingly asserting its political allegiance to the United States in response, right? So the governor recently, in a testimony before the United States Senate committee hearing on the state of U.S. territories, reassured the U.S. about, you know, our government advancing U.S. interests in this region by promising to pivot away from Chinese tourism. This is really significant, right? Because the Chinese tourism market made up more than half of our tourism base. Around 200,000 people from China were coming prior to the pandemic, right? So you're seeing an overall increase in economic militarism by sort of fusing our two main economic pillars together, which are tourism and militarism, which I can't help but think of Theresa's work, of course, on militarism, right, which we see happening before our eyes. the pivot away from Chinese tourism has now resulted in this further reliance on military tourism, not only for military members coming here for R&R, but also in these port visits that we're seeing just in the last couple days. And so in this newspaper article, you see that the governor mentions, my administration is very much committed to the U.S. national interest in our region and will do what we can to advance these interests as geopolitical tensions continue to heighten. Part of this commitment includes the CNMI's pivot away from its reliance on Chinese tourism, and then which he mentions comprises more than 50% of our tourism base. Okay. That's it. The last slide that I just wanted to share was about the way that this militarism, this hyper-militarization is indeed connected to the uptick that we're seeing in Palau. And so we've joined together with some other groups to make a toolkit very recently to comment on one of the most recent environmental impact statements that were happening in Palau. And so this project is really scarce in the amount of detail that included in its document, and we see from the kind of solidarity that we're building with other communities that are militarized that they're experiencing these similar processes, right? And so part of the importance of building that solidarity is being able to kind of resist these processes together. Thank you so much.
Mahalo, Dr. Arriola. Okay, could you stop sharing? Okay, great. All right, next we have Mr. Tatsuki Kohatsu from Ryukyu, Okinawa. Take it away, Tatsuki.
Thank you, Kyle. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Can you see my slide, Kyle? Okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Kyle, and thank you, AAG, for holding this space. My name is Tatsuki Kohatsu, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Hawaii, Mānoa, in the Department of Geography and Environment. So I'm going to, on militarization of the Pacific, I'm going to talk about how people experience militarization of our islands, the Ryukyu archipelago, particularly through two examples of ongoing issues with high concentration of military bases in Okinawa. So Okinawa is an island chain between Taiwan and Japan in the Western Pacific. This archipelago was an independent political entity called Ryukyu Kingdom until it was annexed by the Japanese state in 1879. And Japan continued to expand its territory and sphere of influence until it clashed with the United States in the World War II. And during the World War II, Okinawa turned into a battleground as the Japanese government placed Okinawa to be kind of like a shield to prevent the US troops further advancing toward the main islands of Japan. And after the war, the United States constructed an island chain strategy based on the idea of deterrence for peace and security of the region that included Japan, the Philippines, and also Australia and New Zealand. In this, Okinawa was one of the important strategic sites, and for that, Okinawa remained under US control for 27 years, even after Japan regained its independent status. And during the US occupation period, the US military pursued a military buildup in order to turn Okinawa into a US military outpost as the keystone of the Pacific. And in 1972, the administrative rights of Okinawa were returned to Japan, but the US military stayed in Okinawa as the agreement of the US-Japan alliance maintained that the US military can stay in Japanese territory for peace and security of the region. And currently, approximately 70% of the US bases in Japan are located on Okinawa Island, which is about 0.6% of the Japanese total landmass. and the bases take up 15% of the whole island. And on top of that, now Japan's Self-Defense Forces has been undergoing the deployment of its forces to the islands in the archipelago. And JSDF maintains that this strategic empty space in the East China Sea needs to be filled in order to fortify the first island chain in strengthening the US-Japan alliance. And this ongoing deployment includes radar and observatory units, as well as ground force units on islands, including Yonaguni, Miyako, Ishigaki, Okinawa, and Amami, with deployment of surface-to-air missiles. And the current defense budget of the Japanese government continues to grow, and it's the largest since World War II. And a lot of the focus has been placed on the remilitarization of the archipelago. So along with the potential military conflict, this current deployment increases concerns about a wide range of issues deriving from militarization as a process that works to sustain and materialize the beliefs in military forces. And one example is the construction of a new US military installation in the northern part of Okinawa Island. This is a large-scale landfill project, and it is causing significant damage to the bay that is essential for the lives of the people in the coastal area, and also many marine species. So this construction started as a result of an island-wide protest in 1995, following a sexual assault case of young women by 3 US military personnel. That protest pushed the Japanese and US governments to deal with this high concentration of the bases on Okinawa Island, and resulted in the relocation of base, particularly located in the middle of a densely populated area. But it turns out that the relocation was transfer of the US military personnel to places, including Guåhan and Hawaii, to maintain the US military capability. And for this, particularly in Guam, it led to a construction of new US military base on the land that has cultural and environmental significance for the people of Guåhan, and I'm sure that Ken can talk more about that later. And at the same time, in Okinawa, the relocation of the base took place in the coastal area of Okinawa Island, where the government expected to face less confrontation. And since the construction began in Okinawa, sit-ins have taken place over a period of more than 2 decades, along with lawsuits in both Japanese and US courts to stop the construction. It was originally to be completed much earlier, but it still continues, and the protests have slowed down the construction process. And now the reported soft seabed makes it even undesirable for the use of the facility for the US military operation. But despite such protests and a lot of problems that have occurred, the construction has continued. So in this case, the militarism as beliefs in military forces take precedence over the environments and island lives in order to maintain military capability in the Pacific, causing environmental destruction not only one island, but also the other islands such as Guåhan. And while that is ongoing, another concern that is less visible, but potentially really prevalent all over the island has emerged recently. It is water contamination with PFAS. Because these chemicals do not dissolve in natural environment, they are also known as forever chemicals. Accumulation of these chemicals in human body could lead to serious health issues such as cancers and low weight birth for children. And as shown in the map, high levels of PFAS have been detected in the water sources, particularly surrounding major US military bases. And the contamination has been reported to potentially affect various places, including a water supply facility that supplied water to about 450,000 residents. And one of the primary problems with this water contamination issue is the status of force agreement between Japan and the United States. It allows the US military to decide whether or not on-site investigation can be conducted on base. So now the US military and Okinawa Defense Bureau can kind of ignore and obscure the relationship between the water contamination and military-based operations while denying the request for on-site investigation and continue the military operations. So in this case too, militarism as the beliefs in military forces enables the continued military operations over ensuring the environment and the health and security of people's lives. So for that, local groups has formed a network to exchange information regarding PFAS in their places and communities. They have conducted blood testing to see how much PFAS is accumulated in their body and blood. And also along with local government, they have carried out environmental surveys to see whether soils such as local school grounds are contaminated. And at the same time, journalists have used Freedom of Information Act to get documents regarding operations of military bases, revealing the prevalence of use of PFAS in the military operations. So in doing so, by collecting data and documents, people on the ground seek to make visible the chemicals that are literally invisible to human eyes, and also make visible the relationship between the military operations and water contamination that is obscured by the SOFA agreement. So on the water, while it is happening in Okinawa, groups of Okinawan descendants in Hawaii have also been working to support the struggles for water in Hawaii, especially at the Red Hill water contamination that I think for sure that Kyle and Joy can talk more about later. So in support for clean water, Okinawan groups have been at sign waving walks and other rallies, and in doing so, they make visible the connection between Okinawa and Hawaii as to how similar problems could occur across the ocean where the military bases are, and further shedding critical light on militarism and environment. So with that, I'm going to pass the floor to Joy and Hawaii.
Mahalo, Tatsuki. That's great. Thank you. And so Joy, my comrade, get away.
Okay, let me just share my screen. Can everyone see that? Okay, everyone can hear me? Okay. Aloha mai kākou. My name is Joy Lehuanani Enomoto, and as Kyle mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of Hawaii Peace and Justice. I mahalo to Kyle and to AAG for inviting me to speak on your impending trip to Hawaii. Kyle has already set a wonderful foreground for the history of Hawaii, so I wanted to hone in on some of our more contemporary. I mean, I don't have the time to actually discuss the amount of environmental threat that the US military has posed in Hawaii since it's arrived, going back to the 1890s. So, and actually before that. So I wanted to focus in a little bit on our Red Hill situation. I'm holding up this map that was done by Sean Connolly that shows the sort of annual rainfall and solar map. It's a really cool sort of map. Understanding why there's the "by" inside of the name Hawaii. Hawaii is incredibly, because not only are we strategically important to the United States military for our location and Pu'uloa as a harbor, which I'll get into more, our annual rainfall, our water was one of the most prized things within the Pacific. When whalers, when the military, when anyone came here, they talked about the sheer quantity of water that exists here. And if there was ever a thing to be extracted from us, since we don't have minerals in the way that other places in the Pacific do, water was the thing that was their area of grab. And I want to talk about that because the US military loves to talk about how it is a steward of the land. And it gives this language of somehow protecting us from the very resources that they contaminate. And so let me give a little time. For those of you who don't know, the Red Hill bulk storage facility was built in 1943. It started being built in 1940, before the Japanese assault of Pearl Harbor in 1941. And according to the Sierra Club, since 1943, there's a conservative estimate, 200,000 gallons of fuel. This is everything combined with whether it's oil or jet fuel or other kinds of fuels that are used in the Red Hill facility. The Red Hill facility holds up to 250 billion gallons worth of fuel in 20 tanks. It hasn't held that amount for a very long time. However, that doesn't really matter. It was still in the millions when the leak happened in 2021. But let me just give a brief history. This has been an ongoing threat to our fresh water supply since the military basically grabbed Pu'uloa through what's known as the Bayonet Constitution of 1887, where they strong-armed King Kalakaua into signing a constitution that allowed the US military's sole use of Pu'uloa Harbor. Now, understanding the geography of Hawaii is that we are so strategically located because in order for the US to make its way to Guåhan, to Okinawa, to other parts of the Pacific or Asia, it has to stop with us to get fuel, at least at that time, right? And for many, many years, we are still the giant coaling station of the Pacific. You're not going to make it otherwise. Now, even though they figured out fancy ways of fueling on ships and things like that, basically they come here for fuel loading, right? And also militarism, right? So that they can come and have R&R and all of these things. So in 2014, there were many leaks before this, but we're going to start with just this century's worth of leaks. In 2014, 27,000 gallons of fuel were spilled into the surrounding environment. They checked the water, they checked the wells. It didn't quite reach there. Now, understanding that the tanks, which are a World War II facility, they have dime thin sort of lining that's not really holding up anymore, right? 2014, 27,000. 2020, a 7,700 gallon leak leaked into Pu'uloa. It was not reported, however, right? These things are not reported until 2021 in October, even though it was being reported on, even though it was visibly noticed. The Navy didn't admit that it had done that until 2021. May of 2021, a pipeline released 1,600 gallons of fuel into, again, wells are checked, there's possible debt, right? Going into the soil, right? November 2021, in this entire time, beginning in 2014 especially, you have community organizations, you have the Board of Water Supply, you have all kinds of organizations and institutions telling the Navy that it needs to address this issue. And they ignore it, and they ignore it, and they ignore it, and they dismiss until 2021, a 14,000 gallon fuel water mixture spills into our fresh water supply, effectively poisoning and impacting 93,000 people, primarily Navy servicemen, as well as civilians that are on the same water line. And even then, it was hesitant to close. I mean, even with the entire kind of island up in an uproar, even with all the Board of Supply, Water Supply, Department of Health, and all kinds of entities telling the Navy that it absolutely needs to shut it down, they were like, well, water is important, but fuel is important too. This is a direct quote, right? That kind of attitude, they did finally, after incredible pressure, incredible community organizing by organizations like Hawaii Peace and Justice, but also Oahu Water Protectors, Sierra Club. Finally, they agreed to shut down Red Hill for good. They said it's going to take 2 years. The community was like, you've got to be kidding. There have been leaks since then. However, just this year, right? So the Navy agrees to it. They shut it down. And just last month, October 2023, they began defueling. Now, there was a whole lot of other processes and paperwork and unpacking of the lines, because they knew that the lines that were coming down needed to be made safe, because they knew they weren't safe before they began this massive defueling. The defueling went straight to tankers, which are now on their way to Subic Bay in the Philippines, also to Singapore and to San Diego. Now, there's also, when we know that there's a US facility being built up, and yeah, again, we need to question this word of build up. There's a US storage fuel facility being built in Darwin, Australia, as we speak, as they in this relationship, there's this sort of almost romantic relationship between the United States and Australia in the way that they cooperate in terms of military buildup, as well as New Zealand. And these kinds of this cooperation that's going on within the Pacific, particularly between Australia, the United States, the UK, and New Zealand, these are things that we really need to pay attention to in the Pacific, because this is actually, we are being sort of triangulated around how this buildup is going to work. This idea of never-ending readiness, which I think Ken and Isa both spoke to very well. We have in Hawaii, people, there's a never-ending amount of trainings that happened annually in Hawaii. Now, the most famous one is the Rim of the Pacific exercises, which happens every 2 years, which is the largest maritime exercises in the world. 25,000 personnel come, 26 countries. I think they're actually upping it this year to possibly 27 or 28. This, Hawaii is being used, quite frankly, as a very active training ground to train soldiers who are participating in genocide. And why can I say that? Because the people that are coming from Indonesia are actively part of the suppression of people in West Papua, of natives in West Papua, for the security of the mining interests in West Papua. We know that we're looking at Israel coming through RIMPAC, and we know what's going on right now. We're in the middle of a genocide that is being blatantly ignored, but where Israeli soldiers come here and US Army goes to Israel to train. This relationship is not even, there's nothing subtle about it anymore. There's nothing hidden about it. We know that they're using Hawaii as this training ground. Ho'akuloa, which is like 5 times larger than Ko'olave, which used to be actively bombed by the Navy until a group of Aloha Aina basically stopped the bombing through organizing, through occupying the islands and with their own bodies in 1976. And it took 26 years to stop the bombing in Ko'olave entirely. We're looking at a place that's 5 times bigger than that, where trainings consistently are happening. Now, the US is always using this mantra of readiness. Now, readiness concerns me a great deal, because when the wildfires happened on Maui, and we're surrounded by the military, and we're surrounded by the greatest Navy in the world, and we're surrounded by all of these things, the first thing that Biden did was send in the Army, not to actually help put out the fire, but actually to secure the property of homeowners and private interests, rather than really send in the Navy to bring water ships or anything like that. And I want us to really think about this. We are always military ready to go to war, to create genocide, to cause impact, environmental detriment to most of the Pacific, and yet we're not ready, right? The National Guard went in without any PPE originally, but we are always ready to secure property, American interests. Now, if that's it sounds like an embodied flashback to 1893, which was the argument for why the US troops had to land in Hawaii. Now, when we think about are geographical threats to water. We know that not only is Hawaii's water table being threatened, if the water table breaks at Red Hill, or Pukaki, as we call it, if that table breaks, it will affect the water for 70% of the island, right? We know that in Guåhan that there is a threat to the water, to the one giant water lens there through live fire bombing, through the constant military threats to their water. We know that there is a threat to the Okinawa water lens, right? Through also military presence. What is the US actually playing at is the question that I consistently have, because they are in fact rendering our islands unlivable for human habitation and making it a situation where the military could potentially occupy it to do what it wants, right? We say that, and at the same time, and I just have to read this quote, the Department of Defense said this when we started the defueling. The Department of Defense has worked closely with Hawaii Department of Health and the US Environmental Protection Agency to ensure we are good stewards of the environment as we work toward the timely and safe closure of Red Hill. Timely and safe closure, environmental stewards, right? This is the kind of language that we hear repeatedly from Hawaii to Guåhan to Okinawa, right? These are not the stewards of our land, right? These are not the stewards of our land. It has only been through community organizing. It has only been through the rising up of the people that we actually have posed an ongoing, consistent, indigenous native threat to the US, reminding them that this is not their country, right? That this is not, that these spaces are not theirs, right? And so in 2029, the US Army is coming up for Army lease renewals. Now in 1964, the fake state of Hawaii, basically sold them thousands of acres of land all over for training, for their barracks, for all these things, for $1. That means they have robbed the people of Hawaii of tax revenue since 1964, billions of dollars, millions of dollars of tax revenue, right? And we know that there isn't a clear path, right? In order for the Army to renew those leases, they would have to get certain designations changed. There's certain things that would need to be in place, which they don't really have. Now, we also understand that that the United States is the type of occupier of Hawaii that would in fact be so vindictive as to potentially simply eminent domain those lands or condemn those lands and just keep it, right? However, there is talk, right, at Makua Valley and in other places for the return of these lands. Now, organizing is happening already on the ground. The Army is already trying to get permissions and get things in place to keep those lands, right? Even those lands that it's not even using anymore, like Makua, even those lands that they're not using, that, right? So, but for us to be able to get back any of those lands is incredibly important, right? For us to put pressure to be able to regain those lands and to have the Army clean those lands for the people of Hawaii to be able to restore those lands to go forward is incredibly important, right? So so I just wanted to kind of I know this was pretty quick to close on that, because I know that people are going to have lots of questions, particularly around Hawaii. But the main thing that I want people to walk away with is understanding that the people of the Pacific are consistently hearing the same narrative and theme from the United States and its military on, one, that it's a steward, two, that it has the right to do this, and that in someone else's country, and that it is committed to war. It is not committed to, and this narrative of security, in fact, as Ken stated, is promoting a genuine global insecurity, right? And this global insecurity is preventing us from getting to generative economies, which would be to protect water, which would be to restore the environment, which would be to actually heal the lands and actually allow the people of those lands to prosper independent of imports and ongoing capitalist imposition into our aina. So I'm on that. I'm gonna close and mahalo.
Mahalo, Joy. Okay, so I think that's right on time for us to have about 20 minutes for a question and answer. So, Neil, would you?
Yeah, let me start that process. Joy, you got some fan mail in the Q&A. First of all, this is not a question. Just want to clap for Joy, who is speaking on it. So thank you, and thank all of you. I'm sure if you represented the interests and the issues of your people quite well, and we appreciate that. Let's see. This one is. I believe it's directed to Joy. Do we know how long the leases will be on Hawaii if renewed in 2029?
Al, do you remember the exact date?
So, one clarification I want to make is that these leases are non-renewable, so they expire in 2029, and we don't know what the next iteration might look like. We're trying to say that this is the end of the lease, and it's time for those lands to be cleaned up and restored and returned. But I don't know what the terms might be moving forward. I think it depends on how much political pressure there is from the community and from various actors in the Hawaii. So thanks for that question.
Another one came in. Joy, can you talk more about, and I would say the generative economy is an issue across Oceania, across the world. So anybody could speak to this, but can you talk more about the movement toward generative economies in Hawaii and elsewhere? And what is HPJ or other groups doing in that area? So let's start with you, Joy, but let's not limit it to Hawaii. Let's broaden that discussion.
Definitely not limit that to Hawaii. Well, one exciting thing is that we have a burgeoning youth movement that is beginning to really look at these issues and creating a new a youthful demilitarization movement, which I think is incredibly necessary and timely at this time. And they're beginning to raise these questions because these are the lands that they're inheriting, right? So that's one exciting thing. But when we talk about generative economies, it's, when people consistently separate food sovereignty from militarism, and I've never been able to quite reconcile that. Those folks who are working on the farms, those folks that have to work in conjunction with and are beginning to work in conjunction with folks who have always been committed to demilitarization, like HPJ, Oahu Water Protectors as a new formation, or Sierra Club. But there's also like Hui Aloha Aina, it's Honolulu is also going to be taking on this issue of the army leases and things like that, and looking at what is it that the arguments are coming as to what is it that we want to grow, what is it that we want to see on that Aina, what is the money that the U.S. owes us from all of these failed tax revenue that we have not seen. Like being able to create the data. So currently we're in the sort of, most people are in a research phase of being able to come to the communities to build those arguments and make those connections between food sovereignty and cultural work with demilitarization and the ending of occupation, right? So that you can't disconnect the desire for deoccupation, demilitarization, food sovereignty. These are all interconnected. So we're in that process of actually seeing generative economies are inherently tied to the deoccupation and demilitarization movement. But Ken, you want to speak to that a little more?
If I return to other places, I just want to point out, Joy, the work of the Aina Aloha Economic Futures group that really is, when COVID hit, they put up some outcomes that they asserted that all investment in Hawaii should be gauged. And it dealt less with militarization, but general investment should be assessed based on its production of these various outcomes, which had to do with the vibrance of our environment, cultural vitality, social equity, and, the kinds of opportunities for career and leadership that we seek, so energy sustainability and so forth. So you might want to look at the Aina Aloha Economic Futures website for some really good input on that. Other places, Ken, I think you were trying to turn it over to Ken. So Ken, you want to add there?
Oh, sure. Well, I always think Joy knocks it out of the park each time. So I'll just contextualize it a little bit more for Guam. I think for us, when we think about, essentially for Guam, there are two pillars to the economy currently, emphasis on the word currently. Military projects and tourism. Since COVID, tourism has gone down. And so that's a huge question, right? That's a huge question for our community. And I think part of that comes to realizing how the economy became crafted to be this way. And so we always think about, some of us in Guam, this like Goldilocks zone, where the US will never let us get poor enough to like go out and full out resist. But they'll never make us be rich enough to feel like we can do it on our own. So there's a uncomfortable medium, right? It's sort of like this weird Goldilocks sweet spot, even if it makes all of us uncomfortable, because we're not living that comfortably. In some essence, yes, but there are many more things that we can do. So I think in order to craft a different economy for us, number one, we have to change our political status so we can make our own decisions to the fullest extent. So that's first and foremost. I don't think trying to get the most advantageous economy within our current political status as an unincorporated territory is the right route to go. I think we need to tie generative economies into a political status framework. And so that's the top thing. And then second is just, we're all strategically located. Well, why can't we be, but we're at the same time told we're nothing without the US. So, let's just take that out and say, well, we're strategically located. Let's use that strategic geography for commerce purposes on our own, where we make the decisions, we enter the deals, and then we fight our own governments if they mess it up. And, I think that's where I stand in regards to Guam's future, economic future.
Quick additions from Theresa or Tatsuki, and then we have, the questions are roaring in here, so we want to get to all of these, as many of these as we can. Tatsuki or Theresa?
I just wanted to jump in very quickly. This is a very difficult question, right? Is to think about the economy. How do we make a just transition, right? You get to this wall where you're arguing to demilitarize, but how to move forward, right? So I think you're seeing that from an indigenous perspective, right? Like, how do we value a traditional medicine, right? How do we demilitarize in a way where we can live, right? Like, in a way that's truly sustainable, right? But I think one of the things that often comes to mind when this question comes up to me is it's an opportunity for us to really examine how our political status, what is it offering us, right? What is this relationship with the United States actually doing? Because if you listen to the community members here, at least in the CNMI, one of the most common refrains is we're bought out. There's nothing we can do, right? So there's this strong idea that because we've entered into this political relationship with the United States, and I'm not saying it would be tough to change that, but what I mean is it's kind of a stranglehold for examining how we can move forward, right? So I think part of the issue is really trying to examine how we're actually benefiting, from it creates this security blanket, but as Joy and Ken mentioned, it really is insecurity, right? It's this sense of security that comes from a lot of military funding, but are we actually benefiting in the long term, right? How do we weigh this against the longer term consequences on our environment and our culture, for example? So I think it's really an opportunity to reflect on, is this doing what it actually says it's doing, right? Even economically. And so that's what I'm thinking about.
That's okay.
Yeah, just to quickly add, or just in the context of Okinawa too, just like out of the places like Hawaiʻi, Guåhan, and Northern Mariana, I think Okinawa has been like structurally dependent on military and tourism, but now that like our water and land have been threatened, I think it's, again, like Isa said, it's a good opportunity for us to really think about what we need and how we can move forward. And so that instance too, I'm very grateful to be in the place and learn from these great, brilliant scholars. Yeah.
Thank you. So let me lump a couple of questions together. Given the diversity of political relationships between our respective islands and the U.S. military, what tangible actions for solidarity and political transformation does the panel imagine? And I'll add another question. And what does the path to that change in political status look like? Who wants to kick us off there?
I'm going to just do a very selfish pitch. There is a Protecting Oceania summit that we're doing in 2024 during the Festival of the Pacific that actually is going to raise this exact question to look at what is the next step forward? There is no longer a nuclear-free and independent Pacific. What are the next, well, in our sense, it's what are the grassroots? And I want to stress the grassroots approaches toward the next regional formation, right? I think there's lots of formations. There's a Pacific Island, right? There's all kinds of Pacific formations that exist that argue that they're doing these things, and they get caught up within the geopolitical inertia that's going on. And so one of the things is there's this larger sort of geopolitical question, but there's also what on a grassroots level can drive that geopolitical agenda in a way that it hasn't seen. And I think in this time of rising tides and rising fascism, that no better time than now is to reconsider those questions. So Protecting Oceania 2024, just putting that, Ken's going to be a speaker. Thanks.
That's a concrete step. Kenneth?
Oh, once again, I think go to that event. But you know, it's almost like I'm repeating the same thing, but we're talking about diversity of political relationships. I'm going to emphasize the first part. Right now, right, we have to, it's like community groups, academic exchanges, but on regards to a sovereign level, I don't think attaining sovereignty leads to all of our problems being resolved, but Hawaii, Guam, the CNMI, you know, Okinawa, we can't talk to each other on like a state-to-state level in a way that will actually give us more maneuverability in geopolitics. So, you know, I always return to it, but I do think that the political relationship is dependent on the political status in different ways. And unless we resolve these, if we remove that, because there's a tendency to say, you know, with like climate change solidarity, with demilitarization solidarity, if we remove the variations of sovereignty into the equation, I think we're missing a huge element of what can contribute to us. Now, if we all attain sovereignty in the traditional sense of nation state, just using that line, I know that there's a lot of definitions of that. Is there a chance that we'll just reproduce some of the same problems? Absolutely there is. Okay, so I don't think we're romanticizing sovereignty in a way, but when we're talking about maximum maneuverability in decision making, that's one. So I think that's an eventual goal, but that obviously cannot happen without the grassroots element, and the grassroots element, even if we were our own sovereign countries, will still be incredibly important to keeping our own governments responsible and not be swayed by geopolitics itself.
So what is I think that was a specific question. What is a step you take toward changing the political status?
In the Guam context, we actually do have multiple groups that have been pushing this, but it's very interesting and awesome at the same time. We actually have a part of the government of Guam was created by statute called the Commission on Decolonization, whose whole sole existence is about educating voters about the political status issues for the purposes of an eventual political status plebiscite. And so we have task forces, independence, free association, statehood, and we just released a 700-page study that is totally free online called Gihamotna. I was a main author of that book and study, where we examine under each of the three statuses how will different sectors of our life look like. And so a lot of it begins with education, and we just happen to be lucky to have a government of Guam body dedicated to this that is very much held accountable by grassroots groups in Guam, and a long history of political activism from a lot of our elders. So we're on our way there. there's just a lot more work to be done.
Thank you, Kenneth. Tatsuki,
Can I
or
jump?
oh, go ahead, Kyle. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. No, I just wanted to jump in on the previous question about the economics and political status. You know, I think one Ken mentioned how our strategic locations is something we have all in common in terms of our value to imperial states. One of the other things of value is the diminished sovereignty that each of our islands have to contend with. And that diminished sovereignty, that lack of agency, the lack of authority was produced historically through, you know, these kind of processes of occupation, of colonization, and it produces value. So the diminishment of sovereignty in our various islands produces value for the United States or for other imperial states, right? It accrues to them, but while it's also depleting. So you can think of it as a kind of a resource almost that's been extracted from our region. So shouldn't there be compensation that's owed to elevate, again, the Pacific to its place of having potential, right? Because the potential was robbed in this region. And at one time, places like Hawaii was a neutral and independent country. So what if our region, if the region was neutral and independent, shouldn't that have value for the world to preserve, right? Shouldn't that be something that could contribute to these islands, our islands, having more freedom and more independence in determining the future without it being seen as a weapon or a threat by any other country on the rim? You know, like we remove that by becoming a neutral, independent space, but that should have some value that gets supported by the world system. Just a thought.
And a great one too. Theresa or Tatsuki on this subject?
Yeah, I just wanted to build off of that. I mean, I really think this is why militarization is such a threat, right, to self-determination and sovereignty, right? Because you might look at political status. I don't want to get too like hung up on political status in a lot of ways, right? Because, for example, sometimes people look to us in the CNMI and they say, well, you have more autonomy, right? You're a commonwealth. But what that actually means under the hyper-militarization of the Pacific region at large is that is really not much, right? Like it ends up being not much to even to have that kind of on paper more self-determination, more ability to make more autonomous political decision making, because we're in this stranglehold by the whims, right? By the ebbs and flows of military, you know, as Joy mentioned, readiness, strategy, whatever the kind of terminology is, right? That is building and building towards this future war, right? It's creating the infrastructure to build a opportunities for future war, right? And so we really want to unpack and resist that language that basically gives us no other option, right, but to enter into this war. And so that's why, you know, militarization remains the biggest threat, I think, to self-determination and exercising you know, indigenous sovereignty in the region.
I'm feeling like we're coming to almost to the end of our speed date. But while you're there, Theresa, question for you: do indigenous people see tourists as another threat or as a chance, or both?
I think by and large, indigenous folks here still see them as a chance. You know, I think we have a lot of work to do in connecting this connection that we've been talking about, right? This militarism, how militarism opens the door for extractive tourism, right? And that relationship that leaves us in a very unsustainable situation. And here we find ourselves again in an economic crisis where we're having to rely on the circularity of this logic. But I still think by and large people you know, are hoping that will be an opportunity to gain economically.
Great. Mahalo. So Tatsuki, we were into that question of the next steps or the pathways forward to where the desired state, and then I'll have one more question for all of you to answer.
Thank you. Yeah, next steps in Okinawa, I think kind of echoing what Ken said, education and holding space to talk about why we don't have the agency to decide whether or not we want the military bases or not, or to think about really the colonial history of Okinawa and relationship with Japan, the United States, and there are groups that on the ground that are holding the space to promote education and to talk about it in Okinawa. So yeah, and that's that is going to be a next step for us in Okinawa too.
Thank you. Just make sure I'm not unit. Okay, last question. Can each of you please share some groups and organizers that we can follow, learn from, and support in the work of demilitarization and deoccupation of all of our four areas? Who'd like to start? Theresa, you want to start this?
I just wanted to see if we could throw in some of the groups in the chat so people can follow them. For example, our respective groups maybe that we're in. You can see.
Good idea. So
I'm
check
not sure
your chat, and I'm not sure if the chat will be available to the future viewers of this, but maybe AAG can help them put these things on a website somehow. So Theresa, I see you've done that. And why do you mention these groups? What are they doing?
Oh, these are the respective organizations that we're a part of. So maybe if people want to speak to it, to speak to their organizations. But I mean, it gives you a good idea of like what's happening in the moment, right? A lot of times these when we're dealing with demilitarization work, things are happening very quickly. So it's important to really center Indigenous perspectives on the issue, right? To get a sense of how of what's going on. And then you can draw connections between the groups yourself. As Joy mentioned, we all face very similar problems, right? When it comes to demilitarizing.
Thank you.
I'm not entirely sure if the chat goes to the attendees as well. So maybe what we can do is type the answer to the question of can yeah, I believe it says
To answer the
hosting
question.
panelists. Yeah, to answer the question, maybe we can type these same groups.
Right. Except I think the question was inadvertently moved to answered, so we're in a little bit of a
Yeah, that was my fault because I tried to type in the answer and then it moved it, but maybe I'll just copy some of this here.
If you can find a way to do that. Well, Kenneth is trying to do that, so he doesn't have to talk and type and transfer at the same time. Tatsuki, you want to add your thoughts on this? Some of the groups that are in Okinawa?
In Okinawa, there's a group called Association of Comprehensive Literature Groups. That is a group that I mentioned is trying to promote education on colonization, independence of the Okinawa, and they just went to the United States on the issue of indigenous rights. And also in Hawaii, there's a group called Hawaii Okinawa Alliance. That is a group trying to bring Okinawa and Hawaii together on the issue of militarization. So I'm going to also put that on the chat.
Our friends from Elin from AAG says any resources will be shared via email as well. So I'm not sure if you have the email of all the attendees of this, but keep listing either in the chat or in the question. We can't get it to the questions quite yet. So Kenneth, I was going to give you an opportunity to precede Joy for one time. So if you're not multitasking there, are you able to answer that question?
Sure. For Guam, I founded a think tank, Pacific Center for Island Security. I actually put a link in the chat or in the answer. We do a daily news digest of all geopolitical developments in Oceania and the Asia Pacific region. So if you're looking for sort of every time you wake up, there's something that you can get updated from. I put the Substack link in there. So PCIS, we're Pacific Center for Island Security. There are also groups in Guam like Pertei Latex and Save Retidian that really follow the development of what's going on with anything related to militarism and in Guam. So those are two top groups I would highly recommend.
Thank you, Kenneth. Joy?
Hawaii in particular, obviously I have a bias, Hawaii Peace and Justice. As the longest standing demilitarization organization in Hawaii. And also Malama Makua is a good one to follow. Hui Aloha Aina o Honolulu is going to be very much jumping into this fight as well. And Women's Voices, Women Speak is also a demilitarization organization that has a particularly feminist approach to demilitarization, and is part of the larger Women for Genuine Security. So that's, and also we're also kind of through our youth organization working a little bit with Dissenters, which is a young, an up and coming demil movement that focuses particularly on demilitarizations in the universities as well.
Thank you, Joy. Well, Kyle, kind of give you the last word. You've pulled together this amazing group of really extraordinary thought leaders and engaged us in this important topic. Do you have some thoughts on you want to leave with us today?
No, I just want to thank everyone who attended and all the panelists for sharing with us, and Neil for facilitating. Looking forward to continuing these conversations at AAG. Some of you will be there in person, some virtually. But yeah, these are the pressing issues, some of the pressing issues in our region. And I think that the solution is going to require an archipelagic way of thinking about it, that we are connected, even though we live on islands, we are connected and we need to work together in solidarity. So on that note, I will turn it back to you, Neil.
That's a wonderful end note, and to all, thank you. I joined Kyle in thanking you, certainly the panelists here, as well as our audience, and both live and in the future. And I think we'll take a little hiatus for the holidays coming up, and then I think have our kick back into some more webinars. Look for them in starting in January. I believe we have Ku Kahakalao coming up next, which ought to be a really exciting one. So thank you all very much, and aloha.
Aloha.